Anyone who wishes to retain the simple concept of right and wrong in the postmodern world will quickly find themselves being labelled as intolerant, and this is one of the worst put-downs anyone can receive in our time. The implication of intolerance is that you're full of hate, you're judgmental, divisive, a danger to the unity, and you're proud for thinking that you could possibly have access to an objective truth. No one wants to be called intolerant, and just the suggestion that we might is enough to silence and immobilize many people who might dare to voice their opinion that there is such a thing as absolute right and wrong. Let's have a look at this tolerance issue more closely, and I'll start by asking a question. Should we tolerate breathing? Or should we tolerate eating cheese sandwiches? I think most people would say that's fine. But should we tolerate murder? Should we tolerate rape? I think most people would say no, that we should be intolerant of rape and murder. So actually it turns out that there are things that should be tolerated and things that shouldn't. It turns out that there are things that it's good to be intolerant of. This seems so simple, and the Bible confirms it. Amos 5:15 says, "Hate what is evil, love what is good." Romans 12:9 says the same thing. It is as important to hate evil as it is to love good. In other words, it is as important to be intolerant of evil as it is to love good. So just like that, the postmodern idea of tolerance completely unravels. The fact is that we are all intolerant of some things, things we deem to be evil, and tolerant of others, things we deem to be good. We all find ourselves quickly referring to a concept of right and wrong to decide what should be tolerated and what shouldn't. We don't think murder should be tolerated because we think it's evil. We think eating cheese sandwiches should be tolerated because that's good, that's fine. We're all intolerant of some things and tolerant of others. We only differ on what should be tolerated. So how do we determine what should be tolerated and what shouldn't? Where do we draw the line? Should we tolerate abortions? Should we tolerate gay marriages? To the people who hold unity as the highest ideal, the answer is always yes. Everything that anyone wants to do is good, so it should be tolerated. Let everyone do exactly as they please, all the time. Now this sounds quite loving and noble on the surface, but you will notice that when you say, let others do what they want to do, you automatically reserve that privilege for yourself. Let others do what they want to do automatically implies, let me do whatever I want to do. And let me do what I want to do doesn't sound so noble and loving. In fact, it sounds exceedingly selfish and immature. And that is the real bottom line of this idea of tolerance. The cult of tolerance is a very egocentric, selfish and self-centered view of existence that says, don't make me feel bad about my immorality. Don't bring up any ideas of right and wrong that sear my conscience and trouble my spirit. Just leave me alone to do whatever I want to do, and I'll let you do the same. And if you try to confront me, I'll call you intolerant or judgmental or hateful to immobilize you. Now, interestingly, the golden rule of Satanism is, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. In other words, the core principle of life as a Satanist is to do whatever you want all the time. Everything and anything is allowed if it makes you feel good and works for you. So this cult of tolerance conducted in the name of peace and unity has actually created the perfect conditions for the world to live under a completely satanic philosophy. We tend to think that being outright satanic is to drink blood and dance around cauldrons naked, but the essence of Satanism is far more mundane than that. The essence of Satanism is simply to do what you want. That's why Satanists regard My Way by Frank Sinatra as one of the most satanic songs of all time. With the idea of right and wrong taken out of the way, and everyone living according to their own selfish desires and calling it good, and with objectors immobilized for fear of being called intolerant or judgmental, everything has now become permissible. In this system, we have become our own gods, able to establish our own moral system, our own individual set of subjective truths. There's a saying that for evil to flourish, all it takes is for good men to do nothing. This is what has happened. I can illustrate this by using a scene from Star Wars. Anyone who has watched Return of the Jedi will remember the climactic fight scene where Luke Skywalker is watching the evil Empire destroy his friends. Luke is understandably getting quite angry with the evil emperor as he sits cackling in his chair. Luke notices his lightsaber, and thoughts go through his mind that he could grab it and kill the evil emperor right then and there. The emperor encourages him to do it, saying that if he gives in to his hatred of evil, he will have turned to the dark side and will become evil himself. Luke Skywalker is then rendered completely immobilized. See how this twisted thinking works. By saying hatred of evil is evil itself, Luke ends up immobilized. Similarly, by saying intolerance of evil is evil itself, Christians are immobilized. No one wants to be thought of as intolerant, and so with Christians doing nothing, evil is allowed to flourish. No one will stand up to it, and all of a sudden the golden rule of Satanism, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, rules the land. The cult of tolerance has imposed a standardless standard upon the masses, and our culture has slipped down a moral black hole. You can do anything you want unchallenged, because if anyone dares to say anything, they are being judgmental and intolerant of your truth. This is incredibly clever work by Satan, to have so successfully dressed up rampant self-centered immorality by the names of tolerance, unity and peace. Even more clever that it has rendered Christians unwilling to challenge it. Christians have generally gone into retreat and decided to conduct their faith behind closed doors. We're afraid that if we make truth claims in public, we'll get branded intolerant, and that's been enough to make us shrink back. We have slowly let the command to love our neighbour deteriorate into the politically correct cop-out of leave your neighbour alone. If we are to halt the decline in our nations, then we have to learn to recognise what this system is doing and stand up to it. We have to get the Star Wars philosophy out of our minds and replace it with the biblical command to hate what is evil and to love what is good, and to make the distinction between the two based on God's word. It is not good to be tolerant of evil. It is not good to be tolerant of murder. It is not good to be tolerant of rape. It is not good to be tolerant of any sin. So if we are called intolerant, then good. It shows you have a sense of right and wrong. See that accusation for what it is, an attempt to immobilize you from speaking God's truth into the world. One of Alice A. Bailey's predecessors in the Theosophical Society, in fact one of the co-founders, was Helena Blavatsky, and amongst her books were Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. From that latter book she says, Lucifer represents life, thought, progress, civilization, liberty, independence. Lucifer is the Logos, the serpent, the savior. She later said, it is Satan who is the real God of our planet, and the only God. She also said, the celestial virgin which thus becomes the mother of God and devils at one at the same time, for she is the ever-loving beneficent deity. But in antiquity and in reality, Lucifer or Luciferius is the name. Lucifer is the divine and terrestrial light, the Holy Ghost and Satan at one and the same time. In it she also confirms that the different names for the mystery gods and goddesses are the same being by different names, saying, now we have but to remember that Shiva and the Palestinian Baal or Moloch and Saturn are identical. Helena Blavatsky has many followers of her teaching. Some who are known to be fans of her books were Adolf Hitler, Aleister Crowley, Mahatma Gandhi, Elvis Presley and William Butler Yeats. Her dying words were, keep the link unbroken, do not let my last incarnation be a failure. Her immediate successor was Annie Besant, and then following her came Alice A. Bailey, who in turn became the source of inspiration to Robert Mueller, who in turn became the spiritual figurehead in the United Nations. They've all been links in a chain, and they knew it. So we understand what Robert Mueller means when he boasts that the United Nations is not a man-made creation, but is primarily a spiritual organization with a spiritual source. No human force will ever be able to destroy the United Nations, for the United Nations is not a mere building or a mere idea. It is not a man-made creation. The United Nations is the vision light of the Absolute Supreme, which is slowly, steadily, and unerringly illuminating the ignorance, the night of our human life. The divine success and supreme progress of the United Nations is bound to become a reality. At his choice hour, the Absolute Supreme will ring his own victory bell here on earth through the loving and serving heart of the United Nations. Again, his Absolute Supreme isn't the Christian Absolute Supreme, but is instead the Antichrist. Robert Mueller proudly says here that the United Nations ideal will never be destroyed by any human force because it wasn't created by men but by Lucifer. Now on this subject, the Bible actually agrees. It won't be a human force that brings down the system. It will be Jesus himself, who crushes it into nothingness and blows it away like chaff in the wind. And as Daniel 2:44 then says, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. Robert Mueller wrote ominously in Dispatch magazine in June 2001, "Do not worry if not all religions will join the United Religions Organization. Many nations did not join the UN at its beginning, but later regretted it and made every effort to join. It was the same with the European community, and it will be the case with the world's religions, because whoever stays out or aloof will sooner or later regret it." It might be just me, but there seems to be a hint of menace in those words. It's as though he's saying, if we don't sway you with the Plan A tactics, then be sure that Plan B tactics will follow later. If you don't conform, you're going to regret it. You will be a part of the system one way or the other. The Bible also tells us that these tactics will indeed unfortunately work on many Christians. 1 Timothy 4:1 says, "Now the Holy Spirit tells us clearly that in the last times some will turn away from the true faith. They will follow deceptive spirits and teachings that come from demons." We are already seeing this happening, and that's one reason why I think it's so important to learn this information, so that we see what the enemy is up to and don't fall into the trap. Alice Bailey confirms that it will be the Babylonian mysteries that unites the religions, saying, "Other steps will also be taken in this department of religions and of education, over which the Christ rules, and he will move to restore the ancient spiritual landmarks, to eliminate that which is non-essential, and to reorganize the entire religious field, again in preparation for the restoration of the mysteries. These mysteries, when restored, will unify all faiths." She goes on to explicitly say, "The day is dawning when all religions will be regarded as emanating from one great spiritual source. All will be seen as unitedly providing the one root out of which the universal world religion will inevitably emerge. Then there will be neither Christian nor heathen, neither Jew nor Gentile, but simply one great body of believers gathered out of all the current religions. They will accept the same truths, not as theological concepts, but as essential to spiritual living. They will stand together on the same platform of brotherhood and of human relations. They will recognize divine sonship and will seek unitedly to cooperate with the divine plan. Such a world religion is no idle dream, but something which is definitely forming today." Robert Mueller once more. "The world's major religions must speed up dramatically their ecumenical movement and recognize the unity of their objectives in the diversity of their cults. Religions must actively cooperate to bring to unprecedented heights a better understanding of the mysteries of life and of our place in the universe. My religion, right or wrong, and my nation, right or wrong, must be abandoned forever in the planetary age." Robert Mueller suggested that religions should unite under the authority of the Pope, saying, "We must also hope that the Pope will come before the year 2000 to the United Nations, speak for all the religions and spiritualities on this planet, and give the world the religious view of how the third millennium should be a spiritual millennium, a millennium which will see the integration and harmony of humanity." The Catholic Church, of course, craves the power that would come from having the world under the authority of the Pope. In 1917, in Fatima, Portugal, there was famously an apparition of Mary that appeared to 3 children, saying, "You have seen hell where the souls of poor sinners go. To save them, God wishes to establish in the world devotion to my Immaculate Heart." Notice she said devotion to her Immaculate Heart, not devotion to God. I think we've heard enough now about the United Nations to know what it's up to, but let's make one last stop before we conclude the UN section. Dag Hammarskjöld was responsible for establishing this meditation room in the middle of the UN. He said, "The stone in the middle of the room has more to tell us. We may see it as an altar, empty, not because there is no God, not because it is an altar to an unknown God, but because it is dedicated to the God whom man worships under many names and in many forms. He also said, "The meditation room faces northeast. To enter the room, one must proceed from darkness to light." As well as having an abstract mural which you may be able to do some symbol hunting on, the room is in the shape of a trapezoid. The middle order of Satanism, set up by Anton LaVey, is called the Order of the Trapezoid. He refers to an occult principle known as the Law of the Trapezoid. The trapezoid has long been regarded by occultists as a shape that is especially adapted to enhance demonic manifestation. Kathy Burns wrote, "The bottom line of all this is that the consummate architectural form of the Satan worshipper is the trapezoid, and he believes that this shape will create a spiritual cloud chamber of sorts across which he may track the hoofprints of the demons he wishes to invoke. It is believed to be the perfect atmosphere for the manifestation of the unholy and the cursed." You may be thinking I'm introducing something new and confusing here. I haven't used the word trapezoid before, but look at the pagan temple ziggurat again. You will notice that the sides of these constructions creates a trapezoid shape. With the ziggurats, the person starts off at the wide end at the bottom and gradually works their way up the narrowing levels towards the temple at the top, where the so-called occult illumination is to be found. Similarly, by walking into the UN's meditation room at the wide end and walking towards the narrow end, you are effectively and symbolically approaching the throne of Satan, just as those who ascended the steps of the Tower of Babel would have to have done to gain the audience of Nimrod. To occultists, you are walking from darkness at the lower end to light at the top end. You will therefore notice that the only light in the room comes from the narrow end behind the mural. The occultists don't really care how long it takes to reach their goal. They don't care if their dreams don't materialize in their lifetime. They simply see themselves as cogs of a machine, or like Helena Blavatsky said, links in a chain that will lead to an ultimate end. The Dalai Lama said, "The United Nations becomes for us the answer to world suffering, world darkness, and world ignorance. The inner vision of the United Nations is the gift supreme. This vision the world can deny for 10, 20, 30, 40, 100 years. In other words, we can resist for as long as we like, but it will not stop until it realizes its aim. It may take 10 years, it may take 100 years. The United Nations will keep working towards our enslavement and the establishment of a new world order where the Antichrist can return." We already know that modern-day Israel, at least in an earthly sense, had a lot to do with the efforts of the Rothschilds. Some more symbolism that gives that away can be found in the Israeli Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court was funded by the Rothschilds on the condition that they would choose the plot of land, would use their own architect, and that the price of its construction would never be made public. Built in 1992 in Jerusalem, it sits next to the Knesset, which is the main political building in Israel. Also funded by the Rothschilds, the Knesset is the legislative branch of the Israeli government, where laws are enacted and heads of state are elected. Here is the picture of the Supreme Court. This painting is at the entrance to the building and depicts the Rothschilds planning its design along with Shimon Peres and Isaac Rabin. A journey through the Supreme Court esoterically represents a path towards illumination. The ultimate goal of the journey is to reach this pyramid, which represents the most holy place in the building. Each side of the pyramid has a circular hole at the top representing the all-seeing eye. Let's do a picture walkthrough along this so-called path of illumination from the beginning, and do some symbol spotting along the way. Firstly, the person who enters the Supreme Court finds himself in a dark area in front of a stairway leading to a source of light at the other end. By climbing these stairs, the visitor gradually moves away from the darkness towards illumination. There are exactly 3 sets of 10 steps equaling 30 overall. These represent the first 30 degrees of Freemasonry. Since there are 33 degrees to Freemasonry overall, we will discover where the remaining 3 are later. You'll notice that the right side of the wall is made from rough old rocks, reminiscent of ancient Jerusalem walls, while the left is smooth and modern. This represents the timeless nature of the occult teachings that have been transmitted from ancient Babylon to today, and is a repeated theme throughout the Supreme Court. Having climbed the steps, the visitor finds that he is on a high point with a great view over the rooftops of Jerusalem. We know that Satan wants to try and claim the high points in a region because he wants to be the most high, so no further explanation is required here. Embedded on the floor is a line which guides the traveller to the entrance of the library, which is placed right underneath the Great Pyramid. This is the path you walk to the holiest place, and of course the library itself represents knowledge. This picture is taken from the second floor of that library. The library is actually divided into 3 levels, symbolically representing the final 3 degrees of Freemasonry. The first level is reserved for lawyers only, the second is reserved for judges only, and the books on the third level can only be read by retired judges. This represents the movement through the degrees, acquiring higher and higher knowledge. The library functions like all occult hierarchies, where some information is the exclusive privilege of a select few. These are the 3 levels of the library. Right above the third level, representing the final degree of Freemasonry, there is this view of the pyramid. This is where the Freemasonry ends and the elite Illuminati begins. Directly beneath the apex of the pyramid is this geometric floor pattern, with a crystal embedded in the floor at the center. There are 6 squares representing the number of man, and each square of course has 4 sides, which is the number that represents the world. The crystal in the center lies directly under the apex of the pyramid. This is similar to the sun symbol embedded at the center of the Capitol crypt in Washington, D.C. The entrances to the courtrooms themselves look like this. They are said to resemble ancient Jewish tombs. Apparently in some Jewish tombs there were holes where the soul was supposed to leave. They have retained these holes in the courtrooms, perhaps to allow spirits to come and go in a similar manner. Again, notice the contrast between the old and the new here. The prison cells, the courtroom, and the judges' quarters are placed one on top of the other, symbolizing the tiered society as proposed by Plato and the Enlightenment thinkers. The ruling elite at the top, represented by the judges' quarters, the auxiliaries like the police and civil servants in the middle to enforce the decrees of those at the top, represented by the courtroom, and the massive ignorant prisoners below. This is one of the courtrooms. The judge is illuminated by a natural source of light at the far end, symbolically representing the light of the divine, guiding their wisdom. They retire to their quarters at the top tier to make a decision and then descend back to the courtroom below to bring their illuminating wisdom to the world. Now let's start making our way outside. No occult structure would be complete without the obligatory sexual symbols, and the steps outside the courtrooms provide this feature. Again, this needs little explanation. Once outside the building, we are then invited to visit the Dorothy Rothschild Grove. We find this plaque on the wall with the arrow. Alongside it, we also find this plaque, which also contains an all-seeing eye. Sorry about the quality of these, I couldn't find anything more clear-cut. When we follow the arrow, though, to the Dorothy Rothschild Grove, we find this monument, which is obviously an obelisk, an Ashtoreth pole. If we then go to the center of the parking facilities from here, we find this shape on the ground. Now, some people have suggested that this represents a cross so that people can trample on it as they descend down the steps. I don't personally buy into this theory. To me, it just looks like a sun symbol. All these things, again, are just evidence of the Rothschilds' occult influence. The beginnings of Mormonism will sound quite familiar to anyone who has been following this series. It began when its founder, Joseph Smith, claimed to have been visited by an angel of light called Moroni, who preached to him a different gospel to that found in the Bible. Joseph Smith himself belonged to a family that was heavily involved with Freemasonry. In the Mormon Church and Freemasonry, Terry Chateau writes, "The Joseph Smith family was a Masonic family which lived by and practiced the estimable and admirable tenets of Freemasonry. The father, Joseph Smith Sr., was a documented member in upstate New York. He was raised to the degree of Master Mason on May the 7th, 1818, in Ontario Lodge No. 23 of Canandaigua, New York. An older son, Hiram Smith, was a member of Mount Moriah, Lodge number 112, Palmyra, New York. Joseph Smith was also a Freemason himself, who joined the lodge in 1842. In his book History of the Church he says, he was with the Masonic Lodge and rose to the sublime degree. As a result of these connections, Joseph Smith borrowed heavily, you could actually say plagiarized from Freemasonry in the formation of his own religion, and the two therefore share extensive commonalities in terms of symbols, signs, handshakes, vocabulary, and clothing such as aprons and robes. Mormon temple garments also tellingly bear the square and compass symbol from Freemasonry, although Joseph Smith gave all these things a slightly different meaning. I'm not going to go into too much depth on Mormonism, but we only need to have a quick look around the home and centerpiece of the religion, Temple Square in Utah, which was designed to be an equivalent to the temple in Jerusalem, to see the same old Babylonian symbols. The inverted pentagram representing Satan, for example, is to be found all around Temple Square in many different forms, such as here above the windows. We also see images of the sun, and the combination of sun and moon that represents the union of the male and female principles. Above the door we also find the all-seeing eye peeking out from behind a veil and surrounded by a sunburst. The veil could well represent the initiation of going through the veil towards the light, or the fact that the true nature of the cult is veiled to the uninitiated. One of the ideas Joseph Smith took from Freemasonry for his cult was secret handshakes, and this is also alluded to on the temple. Masonic buildings have similar engravings such as this. Within Temple Square there is a museum documenting the history of the Mormon Church. It too contains the symbols that betray its mystery root. These pentagrams are to be found at the entrance to the museum. Manly P. Hall wrote, "In symbolism, an inverted figure always signifies a perverted power. The average person does not even suspect the occult properties of emblematic pentacles." You'll also find the sun god symbol at the same entrance, just right of the pentagrams. And now finally, here are some more of those inverted pentagrams in the kids' corner. Mormons are similar to Catholics in that many Christians are not sure what to make of them. They seem to be clean living, well-meaning, and use many of the same words as us, so there can be an attitude that they're basically on the same team with just one or two unorthodox ideas. Mormons actually believe that they can become gods through being a good Mormon, who will one day be given godhood over their own universes, and that God himself was once a man on another planet. These are, of course, lies straight from the serpent's mouth. They believe the Book of Mormon has higher authority than the Bible. They believe that there are many gods, that there is a mother god, that God has a goddess wife, that there is no salvation outside of the Mormon Church or without acknowledging Joseph Smith as a prophet, and they also state that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was not enough by itself, and that we need to do good works as well, which is always a mark of a false religion. Hopefully this information, along with a quick look at the symbols, will tell you just who the spiritual power behind the cult of Mormonism really is, and you will discover it has no compatibility with Christianity at all. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a far more subtle cult in many ways than Mormonism, but their ideas will be recognizable to you if you've come this far in the series. The Jehovah's Witnesses were founded by a man called Charles Taze Russell in the late 19th century, and the first thing to say about him is that he believed that lying was a good thing if the end justified the means. This has been a recurring theme throughout the series that we've seen in relation to Plato, Islam, and the Illuminated Masons in particular. Their own publication, the Watchtower magazine, stated on May 15, 1960 that the scriptures justify the war strategy of hiding true facts from the enemy. The following month, on June 1st, 1960, it repeated the idea, saying, as a soldier of Christ, he is in theocratic warfare, and he must exercise caution when dealing with God's foes. Thus the scriptures show that for the purposes of protecting the interests of God's cause, it is proper to hide the truth from God's enemies. Because Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe anyone outside of their cult has true salvation, that means that Christians are included along with the enemies of God in their eyes. That means they believe it is acceptable to lie to us if the end justifies the means. This instantly removes any weight we may have otherwise given to their words, and we have to instead look at their actions, ideas, and symbols for the truth. Charles Taze Russell was a member of a congregational church as a youth, but in his teens he lost faith and, hungrily, he began investigating the heathen religions in search of the truth on God's purpose and man's destiny. He picked up many occult ideas and intermingled them with his own faith, and also gained a number of Masonic friends. Although there is much debate about how involved he was with Freemasonry and whether he was a Mason himself, what is clear is that he exalted Masonic beliefs and used occult images in his own publications. In a discourse he gave in 1913 called The Temple of God, he said, "I am very glad to have this particular opportunity of saying a word about some of the things in which we agree with our Masonic friends, because we are speaking in a building dedicated to Masonry, and we are also Masons. I am a Freemason. I am a free and accepted Mason, if I may carry the matter to its full length, because that is what our Masonic brethren like to tell us, that they are free and accepted Masons. That is their style of putting it. I trust we all are, but not just after the style of our Masonic brethren. We have no quarrel with them. I'm not going to say a word against Freemasons. In fact, some of my very dear friends are Masons, and I can appreciate that there are certain very precious truths that are held in part by our Masonic friends. I have talked to them at times, and they have said, 'How do you know about all of these things?' We thought nobody knew anything about these things except those who had access to the very highest logic." Russell went on to use a Masonic name for God, saying, "I had been in conference with the great master workman, the Lord himself, and I have secret information. And so, if we talk to our Masonic friends about the temple and its meaning, and about being good Masons, and about the Great Pyramid, which is the very emblem they use, and what the Great Pyramid signifies, our Masonic friends are astonished. We are going to discuss free and accepted Masonry, the Bible Masonry, my dear friends." In both those quotations, his Masonic friends seem surprised that Charles Russell knows the same information they do. This goes further when Russell says, "You know our order is so secret we cannot know each other always. Is that not wonderful? I find that it is so with Masons also. Many Masons shake hands with me and give me what I know is their grip. They don't know me from a Mason. Something I do seems to be the same as Masons do. I don't know what it is, but they often give me all kinds of grips and I give them back. Then I tell them I don't know anything about it except just a few grips that have come to me naturally." Russell seems to be saying that somehow he knows about Freemasonry, but he doesn't know how he knows. It just comes naturally to him. But he then goes on to say that he in fact knows more about occult things than Freemasons themselves do. Do our Masonic friends understand something about the temple and being Knights Templar and so on? We more. This next quotation from that discourse is very telling indeed. "Blessed are your eyes, for they see. Not everybody has the hearing ear and the seeing eye. It is only those who have come into this divine Masonry that have the spiritual insight and the spiritual guidance, and may know the things that are freely given to us. It is something that is freely given to one class and not intended for anyone else." Russell therefore had no problems in his followers joining Masonry, saying, "If you feel that you want to become a member of the free and accepted order of Masonry, and do not feel free and Masonic enough as a follower of Christ, God bless you. Use your own judgment. That is yours to decide, not mine." Finally he said, "So you and I as under Masons are waiting for the return of the Master Mason. Therefore we are unsurprised when we find this winged sun disk symbol which was prevalent on early Watchtower publications. Here we also see it on their Kingdom Hall in Queens, New York. I am led to believe that this too has recently been taken down as it was starting to cause too much controversy. Early issues of the Watchtower had this front cover, which has a bit of sun symbolism, although nothing especially incriminating. The Watchtower with the illuminating light coming from the top also hints at the old Babylonian tower theme, but it's presented as a kind of lighthouse rather than a ziggurat. This seems to me to be the subtlety of the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's like Russell was constantly hinting at occult ideas and dancing around them, but disguising them or distancing himself just enough for them to avoid incrimination. Further research will tell you that the other symbols here, particularly the cross and crown, may have deeper meanings, but because they're not connected to anything I've covered so far, I'll bypass them and leave you to do your own investigation there. The whole Jehovah's Witnesses organization are controlled by a governing body of 10 to 15 mature men, who they believe receive direct guidance from the spiritual realm. The governing body then instructs the followers through the pages of the Watchtower publications, and these decrees are enforced by elders within local assemblies. We're basically talking about a power hierarchy here, where those at the top claim spiritual authority to enforce their temporal authority. Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that Scripture alone is insufficient to understand the things of God, and that they need the teachings of the governing body as passed down through the Watchtower to properly understand the Bible. They say, Jehovah God has also provided his visible organization, his faithful and discreet slave, made up of spirit-anointed ones. Unless we are in touch with this channel of communication that God is using, we will not progress along the road to life, no matter how much Bible reading we do. They teach that people are not to think for themselves, but are to rely upon this hierarchy for true knowledge, saying, but a spirit of independent thinking does not prevail in God's organization, and we have sound reasons for confidence in the men taking the lead among us. There are similarities here to the Catholic Church and all the pagan hierarchies, in that they try to keep control by teaching their followers to develop a dependency on the hierarchy for truth, and not to think for themselves. Also, like Catholicism, they strengthen that control by saying that if anyone goes against their teaching, they will be removed from the fellowship and therefore will lose their salvation. The use of guilt and fear to control the followers is enough to keep them towing the party line. Anyone who has tried to leave will know how controlling an organization it really is. Jehovah's Witnesses are also expected to spy on one another and report any misdemeanors to the elders. If they don't, they run the risk of being disfellowshipped themselves. People can be disfellowshipped for such things as speaking to a disfellowshipped person and reading material that hasn't been approved by the governing body. So in that we see the same old attempts to keep a firm grip on the information flows. Those information flows say that Jesus Christ is not God. Jesus Christ is a created being. The Archangel Michael is a god. That Christ's body was not resurrected, and that the Christian Church is not preaching the gospel. Why do the Jehovah's Witnesses have so many doctrines that are in common with the doctrines of demons? Well, as I mentioned, their governing body believes it is experiencing direction from the spiritual realm. They believe that direction to be angelic. Vindication, Volume 3 says, the heavenly messengers are angels of the Lord, now used by the Lord in behalf of the remnant. These angels are invisible to human eyes and are there to carry out the orders of the Lord. No doubt they first hear the instruction which the Lord issues to his remnant, and then these invisible messengers pass such instruction on to the remnant. Raymond Franz, an ex-member of the governing body, confirmed in his book, Crisis of Conscience, that they made decisions not on the Bible or by prayer, but by this angelic direction. They claim these angels also direct the writing of the Watchtower magazine. The Lord used the Watchtower to announce these truths. Doubtless he used his invisible deputies to have much to do with it. On top of this, they practiced necromancy, communication with the dead, as they claimed that Charles Russell continued to contact them after death to guide the organization. Though Pastor Russell has passed beyond the veil, he is still managing every feature of the harvest work. We hold that he supervises, by the Lord's arrangement, the work yet to be done. Also, hence our dear pastor, now in glory, is without doubt manifesting a keen interest in the harvest work, and is permitted by the Lord to exercise some strong influence thereupon. The Watchtower has made numerous false prophecies and set wrong dates that have come and gone. They have mistranslated the Bible, endorsed things like numerology, spiritism, necromancy, astrology and masonry. Clearly, whatever they are in contact with is not from God. Finally, this is a close-up of the inscription on Charles Taze Russell's grave. You may be surprised to see what kind of shape this grave takes. What is also significant is that there's a building in the background, and if we were to walk down the slope to the foot of the flagpole, we would see this. This is the Greater Pittsburgh Masonic Center. I need to keep repeating that no human beings are our enemies, and that these individual organizations are not our enemies. Keep looking beyond the princes of Tyre to see the king of Tyre. Our enemies are spiritual, not physical. There is one final area of false Christianity that deserves a little bit more attention, simply because it's emerging from within biblical Christianity and leading many astray: the emerging or emergent church movement. This is a very powerful deception because it contains so much truth, and those who are not aware of Babylonian ideas will find them very hard to spot, as they are subtly interwoven into the movement. If left unchecked, it threatens to draw many away from the faith and to contribute towards the great falling away prophesied about in the period prior to Christ's return. The general idea behind the emergent church is that the postmodern era has produced a culture shift, and that the way we think of Christianity, therefore, also has to change to stay relevant to that culture. Leith Anderson wrote, "The only way to cope and be effective during this period of structural change in society is to change some of the ways we view our world and the church. It is what some might call a paradigm shift, a new way of looking at something. Such a shift will allow us to view our changing world with a new perspective. It is like a map. Old maps from the 1950s may have sufficed before the construction of interstate highways and the expansion of major cities, but new maps are needed now. Likewise, we need a new paradigm for the future." So basically, the Christianity of the modern era is no use in the postmodern era. Instead, they want to blend postmodernism with Christianity, to take the postmodern ideas we've been looking at, ideas that unity is more important than truth, that we can have different beliefs that are equally valid, or at least no one can be sure of who has the truth, that we can play a part in building a one-world utopian society, that the here and now is more important than eternity, and that Christianity should therefore be primarily concerned about social justice and unity with Catholicism and other religions. Because they know that the truth is divisive, they hate the concept of absolute right and wrong, and will instead ask endless questions. To them, their questions never lead to solutions, but merely to more questions, and they seem to like it that way. They think that this is enlightened thinking. Because the second you claim to have an answer to those questions, you have become arrogant and divisive, and may offend someone else's idea of truth. Because they never reach a conclusion or settle on absolute statements, they also talk a lot about conversation. Conversation is a key word for the emergent church. They ignore the wise advice of G.K. Chesterton when he says, "The point of having an open mind, like an open mouth, is to close it again on something solid." They don't like solid things, they don't like absolutes, which is why it has been said that trying to define the emergent church is like trying to nail jelly, or jello if you're American, to a wall. As soon as you try and pin them down on something, they'll shift their position. They have very basically swallowed the lies from the spirit of the postmodern age and have mixed them with Christianity, in much the same way Catholicism mixed the pollution of the pagan culture that surrounded it in Rome. Catholicism partly did this to make the Christian message more palatable to the pagan culture, and the emergent movement is doing much the same thing, watering down or removing the truth altogether to create unity with the world. The whole emergent movement can be traced back several decades, but it really picked up speed in the mid-1990s. Mark Driscoll, the pastor of Mars Hill Church in Seattle, was involved in the movement in those days. He says, "In the mid-1990s, I was a young church planter trying to establish a church in the city of Seattle when I got a call to speak at my first conference. It was hosted by Leadership Network and focused on the subject of Generation X. Out of that conference, a small team was formed to continue conversing about postmodernism. By this time, Leadership Network hired Doug Paget to lead the team and organize the events. He began growing the team, and it soon included Brian McLaren. Paget, McLaren and others such as Chris Say, Tony Jones, Dan Kimball and Andrew Jones stayed together and continued speaking and writing together as friends. That team eventually morphed into what is now known as Emergent. Those are just some of the names you'll hear along with the likes of Rob Bell and Tony Campolo amongst others, and they are unfortunately accepted and promoted in many evangelical circles. Hopefully this study will have allowed you to see clearly how Satan is using this as part of his agenda. Here are some quotes. Tony Jones said, "Emergent doesn't have a position on absolute truth, or on anything for that matter. Do you show up at a dinner party with your neighbours and ask, what's this dinner party's position on absolute truth? No, you don't, because it's a nonsensical question." Tony Jones again said, "This is actually about changing theology. This is about our belief that theology changes. The message of the gospel changes. It's not just the method that changes." So instead of the biblical truth changing our culture, his idea is that culture should change the biblical truth. In fact, he doesn't believe that the Bible has any objective truth at all. So we must stop looking for some objective truth that is available when we delve into the text of the Bible. Brian McLaren repeats this idea when he says, "Let me offer 10 suggestions for reclaiming the Bible for contemporary readers. Drop any affair you may have with certainty. None of us can be certain of anything, and the Bible can be interpreted any way an individual likes, and who is to say which interpretation is correct? The truth can't be known. This means that everyone is free to do exactly what they like and to adapt the Bible to fit with their individual concepts of truth." Rob Bell backs this up when he says, "Anytime someone makes you feel guilty about how you are living, that is part of the old system." What Rob Bell is effectively saying is to let each other do what they want to do. He is in fact promoting the satanic maxim, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Tony Jones in fact recommended ripping out parts of the Bible that would oppose this worldview, at least temporarily, when he said, "Maybe some evangelicals should tear the book of Romans out of their Bibles and read a Romans-free Bible for a few years. Then they can paste it back in." Josh Reich talks about globalism and embracing Babylonian mysticism when he says, "Some of the values of the emerging church are an emphasis on emotions, global outlook, a rise in the use of arts, and a rise in mysticism and spirituality." These words are dripping with the spirit of the age, and you should clearly be able to see from the study how they are designed to draw Christians into the New World Order by causing them to abandon biblical truths with a new type of Christianity that is more earth-centered, embraces other faiths and ideas of truth, and which promotes the idea of contributing towards the man-made utopia. We'll look some more at this in the next couple of parts. In 1995, Rick Warren joined emerging church leader Leonard Sweet to do an audio series called Tides of Change. In it, they talked about a new spirituality which was necessary for an age of transition, in which the old modern ways of yesterday no longer worked effectively. Leonard Sweet in turn says he was influenced by a myriad of what he calls New Light leaders, which are actually just New Agers. One of these acknowledgements goes to Matthew Fox, the author of The Coming of the Cosmic Christ. It is in reading his work that we start to see the old themes. "I foresee a renaissance, a rebirth based on spiritual initiative. This new birth will cut through all cultures and all religions, and indeed will draw forth the wisdom common to all vital mystical traditions in a global awakening I call deep ecumenism." That quote could easily have come from Alice Bailey. Loosely translated, he sees everyone coming together under one religious system. The theme of that whole book is that all humans have Christ consciousness within them. Taking inspiration from this, Leonard Sweet writes in his own book, Quantum Spirituality, "Mysticism, once cast to the sidelines of the Christian tradition, is now situated in postmodernist culture near the center. Too many people are nothing, as our empty pews are shouting at us, because we give them neither an energy fire experience of Christ, nor the Christ of an energy fire experience. We may help them apprehend reality through the rudiments of mystical speculations. Mysticism begins in experience, it ends in theology." Because the postmodern world is now abandoning outright atheism and is going back to mystery spirituality, Sweet suggests here that Christianity capitalize on that by incorporating mystery spirituality into their church in order to attract people into the pews. If people want mysticism and strange experiences, let's give it to them with a Christian facade. He says that mysticism is all about experiences that excite the senses. It's all about what you feel and not about what is true or false. This is a clear path to deception. Leith Anderson wrote, "The old paradigm taught that if you had the right teaching, you will experience God. The new paradigm says that if you experience God, you will have the right teaching. What you feel comes first. What is true comes second. Therefore, all Satan has to do is give them a strange experience, and they will not question its source. They will assume it has come from God and follow it. This easily leads to deception, as we have seen over and over throughout history how Satan is able to disguise himself as an angel of light and has inspired people to follow his paths by this method. In order to facilitate this process of exciting the senses and making people feel like they're having a God experience, emerging churches use multisensory worship, which is designed to bombard senses of sight, smell, touch, taste and hearing. This sensory overload makes you feel a certain way, even if it's done with smoke and mirrors, and therefore you are inclined to trust and absorb the teaching, however dark it may be." Speaking of darkness, one of the keys to emerging worship is creating an atmosphere of darkness. Emerging leader Dan Kimball writes, "In the emerging culture, darkness represents spirituality. We see this in Buddhist temples as well as Catholic and Orthodox churches. Darkness communicates that something serious is happening. You see, because they are part of a conversation and feel it's arrogant to claim Christianity is any better than another religion, they feel they have something to learn from things like Buddhist temples, and are therefore ready to incorporate elements of other religions into their own. Just as there isn't anything really new about the New Age at all, and it's just a regurgitation of ancient ideas, the same is true for the emerging church. They talk about a new way of doing things for the postmodern era, but it's really just incorporating old lies. They often use the term vintage Christianity, referring to the need to recover pagan elements of Catholicism that the Reformation removed. They may also use the term ancient future worship, which implies the same thing, rediscovering ancient Babylonian mystical ideas for the future. We've already heard Tony Campolo talking about the way he uses Catholic mysticism in his faith when he said, "I learned about this way of having a born-again experience from reading the Catholic mystics, especially the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. Like most Catholic mystics, he developed an intense desire to experience a oneness with God. We know that these spiritual exercises led to an encounter in the cave with a serpent, and his so-called secret knowledge had ugly consequences to say the least." Campolo also said, "After the Reformation, we Protestants left behind much that was troubling about Roman Catholicism of the 15th century. I am convinced that we left too much behind. The methods of praying employed by the likes of Ignatius have become precious to me. With the help of some Catholic saints, my prayer life has deepened." So along with the rest of the emergent movement, he's saying, let's put aside our differences with Catholicism and undo the Reformation by merging Christianity with it. How quickly people forget. 1,000 years of dark ages culminating in the most atrocious wickedness from the Jesuits, and within just a few hundred years of them being exposed and driven out, modern-day leaders are ready to get back into bed with the whole system. Our forefathers just a few generations back were ready to lay down their lives rather than accept such pagan pollution. Today, there are teachers who are readily accepted within Christian circles that are actively promoting a unification with Rome. Robert Weber, another emerging leader, agrees with this ecumenism when he says, "A goal for evangelicals in the postmodern world is to accept diversity as a historical reality, but to seek unity in the midst of it. This perspective will allow us to see Catholic, Orthodox and Protestant churches as various forms of the one true church, all based on apostolic teaching and authority, finding common ground in the faith expressed by classical Christianity." Brian McLaren is in the same boat. Many Christian leaders started searching for a new approach under the banner of spiritual formation. This new search has led many of them back to Catholic contemplative practices and medieval monastic disciplines. This has coined the phrase new monasticism, and it is something many well-meaning Christians have been taken in by. You may have heard of something called boiler rooms, which are designed to be an outworking of new monasticism, whereby people maintain a continual rhythm of prayer. Of course, if we were to unite with Catholicism, we would be uniting with the goddess of that religion, who is Asherah in the form of Mary, and we know she has always been completely hostile to Christians throughout history and will have no equals. The Catholic Church has a program to evangelize the whole world, to bring people to Mary, and several Catholic authors have written books about where they see this plan heading. One such author is Thomas W. Petrisco, who wrote the book Mother of the Secret, From Eucharistic Miracles to Marian Apparitions, Heaven has sought to illuminate and defend what was once the Church's greatest secret. Petrisco sees the Church's greatest secret becoming the cornerstone of a glorious new era. He states in his book, "Visionaries foretell that mankind will move from a secular, agnostic, practically atheistic realm into a world that basks in the reality of God and belief in the supernatural. The prophets say that mankind will then thrive on secure faith and confidence in this reality, for true peace will rule and the Church will reign supreme. Most notably, many Catholic visionaries insist that the world will at last come to deeply understand the power, the mercy, and the grace that is available in the miraculous presence of Jesus Christ in the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. The Eucharist is the circular wafer representing the sun that is placed inside the crescent moon-shaped monstrance and actually represents Baal, not Jesus. And of course, he is only saying what the occultists like Albert Pike, Alice Bailey, and Helena Blavatsky have been saying for a long time. People will largely abandon atheism and go back to a new age of mystery spirituality. It's already happening. But the key point is that he believes that Mary, aka Asherah, will be key to all this. It is said that the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary during our times will gloriously lead the world into a new era of peace. Ted and Maureen Flynn expand upon this idea in their book, The Thunder of Justice. As John the Baptist prepared the way for the first coming of Christ, Mary prepares the way for his second coming. Mary proclaims that a new world and era is upon us, and the triumph of her Immaculate Heart and the second Pentecost will usher in the reign of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. Occultists believe that the goddess is preparing the way for their Antichrist. Remember, Anton LaVey called this the Age of Lilith, and believed it began with the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, so we're already over 50 years into it. According to the Flynns, the coming of this false Christ is very near, as they say they received a prophecy from the Blessed Mother saying, "The glorious reign of Christ which will be established in our midst, and the second coming of Jesus into the world is close at hand." Another Catholic, Dwight Longenecker, writes in The Road to Rome that, "As we enter the third millennium, Catholicism, evangelicalism, and orthodoxy will continue to converge." Thomas Merton, a Catholic mystic who has been an inspiration to many in the emerging movement, sums up what many feel. "We are already one, but we imagine that we are not, and what we have to recover is our original unity." The emerging church that embraces these ideas of ecumenism is trying to lead evangelical Christians back to Rome and the mysteries that course through its veins. The emerging philosophy goes even further than ecumenism with Rome, however. Because they adhere to the idea that truth is unknowable, they don't agree that they are the light of the world that needs to shine in the darkness. Instead, they believe in entering into conversation with other religions on equal terms. Brian McLaren writes, "Ultimately, I hope Jesus will save Buddhism, Islam, and every other religion, including the Christian religion, which often seems to need saving about as much as any other religion does." He also says, "I must add, though, that I don't believe making disciples must equal making adherents to the Christian religion. It may be advisable in many, not all circumstances to help people become followers of Jesus and remain with their Buddhist, Hindu, or Jewish contexts. In the following quote, he also places Jesus on a level with Muhammad, saying, "And during his lifetime, Abraham, like Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, had an encounter with God that distinguished him from his contemporaries and propelled him into a mission, introducing a new way of life that changed the world. How appropriate that the three Abrahamic religions begin with a journey into the unknown." We have seen that Muhammad did have an encounter with something, but it wasn't God, and that Islam does not stem from the same Abrahamic root as Judeo-Christianity. But what McLaren is leaning towards in these quotes is in fact universalism, the idea that you can find God through any religion. Spencer Burke agrees, saying, "When I say I'm a universalist, what I really mean is that I don't believe you have to convert to any particular religion to find God. As I see it, God finds us, and it has nothing to do with subscribing to any particular religious view." The May-June 2000 issue of Watchman's Trumpet magazine elaborates on what this means. Messianic Muslims, who continue to read the Quran, visit the mosque and say their daily prayers but accept Christ as their saviour, are the products of the strategy which is being tried in several countries. They continued a life of following the Islamic requirements, including mosque attendance, fasting and Quranic reading, besides getting together as a fellowship of Muslims who acknowledge Christ as the source of God's mercy for them. Mike Oppenheimer of Let Us Reason Ministries has done some research on how this new idea of missions works out. He says something very telling. Can a Christian now call himself a Muslim? The word Muslim is made up of two words, Islam and Mu. Muslim does not just mean submission, it means submission to the God Allah, not the Lord Jesus Christ or Yahweh. Can a Muslim be called a Christian and walk with Allah? This seems to make no doctrinal or practical sense, unless they change the names and the meaning. This only brings confusion. Why do this when you can introduce Yahweh as the true God without any baggage and shuffling around in names, nature, or description? The answer is that you may not see the same results. This is what this is all about, isn't it? Results, pragmatism, the end justifies the means. There's that phrase again, the end justifies the means. Do anything to get the required results. It's the occult way. And remember, this is what the Catholic Church did in pagan Rome. They basically said, keep your paganism, but let's just change some names and try to throw Jesus into the mix. All that they introduced was paganism with a Christian mask. But what fellowship can light have with darkness? Rob Bell recently published his book, Love Wins, in which he speculates in his uniquely non-committal, hypothetical, fuzzy, wishy-washy, self-contradictory way that in the end everyone will reach heaven. He says, "People come to Jesus in all sorts of ways. Sometimes people use his name, other times they don't." Acts 4:12 contradicts Bell, saying, "There is salvation in no one else. God has given no other name under heaven by which we must be saved." Here are some other quotes from emerging church leaders in favor of this idea that people don't need to change their faith in order to attain heaven. Firstly, Leonard Sweet says, "New light embodiment means to be in connection and information with other faiths. One can be a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ without denying the flickers of the sacred and followers of Yahweh or Kali or Krishna." Rick Warren says, "I happen to know people who are followers of Christ in other religions." Peter Kreeft says, "Allah is not another God. We worship the same God. The same God, the very same God we worship in Christ, is the God of the Jews and the Muslims." Alice Bailey says the same thing. "I would point out that when I use the phrase, followers of the Christ, I refer to all those who love their fellow men, irrespective of creed or religion." Can we see how closely the words and ideas of the emerging church movement mimic those of occultists? Alice Bailey also says, "The reason he has not come again is that the needed work has not been done by his followers in all countries. His coming is largely dependent, as we shall later see, upon the establishing of right human relations. The Church has hindered and is not helped because of its fanatical zeal to make Christians of all peoples and not followers of Christ. It has emphasized theological doctrine and not love." So the problem is that we have been emphasizing truth too much. The emerging church agrees. Notice also here that Bailey makes a distinction between the term Christian and Christ follower. The emerging movement has encouraged us to drop the term Christian in favour of Christ follower, which is a looser term. Remember, many people followed Jesus around Israel when he preached, but not all that followed accepted his claim to be God. Many of those that followed were in fact Pharisees. Following from a distance is not enough. We were bought with his blood and are now slaves to Christ, nothing less. Here Bailey also alludes to the fact that we have been the barrier to the coming of the Antichrist because of our uncompromising determination to see that people hear about the gospel truth and become Christians. The emerging church follows the advice of the occultists like Bailey, however, and instead of giving people the truth, they tell them that they can keep whatever religion they have, but just add Christ. But which Christ is it? The Christ of ecumenism with Rome and with Babylon is not the Christian Christ. Emerging church leader Erwin McManus wrote, "My goal is to destroy Christianity as a world religion and be a recatalyst for the movement of Jesus Christ. Some people are upset with me because it sounds like I'm anti-Christian. I think they might be right." Of course, you cannot be in relationship with the Christ of the Bible while simultaneously remaining in the confines of a false religion rooted in Babylon, worshipping satanic idols and believing in doctrines of demons. You must leave that religion completely and give your life to Jesus, not just add him on. The kingdom of light has no partnership with the kingdom of darkness. The only Christ that you can be in relationship with under this system is the false Jesus, the false Christ, the one spoken about by Alice Bailey, the Antichrist. The emergent church are duping people into believing they are saved as a Buddhist or Muslim just because they have tacked a false Christ onto the end. So when emergents talk about bridging the gap to non-Christians, they aren't talking about reaching them with the pure gospel, they are talking about compromise. Leonard Sweet explains, "The key to navigating post-modernity's choppy, crazy waters is not to seek some balance or safe middle ground, but to ride the waves and bridge the opposites, especially where they converge in reconciliation and illumination." Followers of the emergent ideal, therefore, take the approach that to reach the world you have to immerse yourself in the world, to enjoy the things the world enjoys, to go to the places the world goes, to indulge in popular culture. What we find in these churches is that the world is coming into the church rather than the church going into the world. People involved in the emerging movement have to ask themselves, who is evangelizing who here? We have been instructed to be in the world, but in no sense of the world. It is impossible to immerse yourself in an ever more polluted culture and not be affected. We will become deceived with the standards of the world unless we keep ourselves holy before God. Finally, because the emerging church believes that doctrinal truth is essentially unknowable, the only real substance they believe Christianity has to offer the world is found in social action or social justice. If it's arrogant of Christians to claim that we have the one and only route to everlasting life, and we can't offer hope for eternal salvation with certainty, and if everyone's going to be saved through their own faiths anyway by just tacking Christ onto the end, they assume that will take care of itself, and instead their ultimate goal becomes making the world a better place. They believe in the same man-made utopian ideal long held by occultists and think that paradise can be achieved here on earth by social activism and that is all Christians really have to offer the world. The deception here is particularly powerful because of course Christians should be doing all those things. They should be feeding the hungry and giving to the poor. But the underlying philosophy behind these actions for the emerging church is that we can build God's kingdom ourselves and that we are in the process of evolving towards a utopian society that abolishes true faith in Christ and which joins hands with the Babylonian religion. The kingdom that man makes on this earth will be the Antichrist's kingdom. We know that. The Bible tells us clearly. We've heard Alice Bailey talking about creating the perfect conditions for the return of their Christ by all the religions abandoning Christianity and coming together under one system. What I hope I've done is show how the emerging movement is playing its role in drawing Christians into that, with powerfully deceptive lies that are mixed with truth. Before we end the emerging church section, I should also point out that the idea of man establishing a utopia before Christ returns fits in with a theory that Christians call post-millennialism. I don't like using theological jargon, but it basically means that we'll create God's kingdom which rules the world peacefully for 1,000 years, and then Jesus will return at the end of those 1,000 years. The opposite view is called premillennialism, and this is the idea that Jesus will come back and himself will establish his own kingdom, which will usher in a 1,000-year period of peace. As you can see, Christians who hold to the postmillennialism view, the idea that we can create world peace ourselves, may, and I emphasize the word may, be at risk of being drawn into the pagan attempts to build a man-made utopia. I believe it is clearly the biblical stance that Jesus will establish his own kingdom prior to the millennial reign. Our job between now and his return is simply to make sure that as many as possible will be ready to meet him as their Lord and Saviour when he comes. Right at the start of this whole series, we learned that Satan is called the ruler with authority in the region of the air, and that he works from that position in those who are disobedient to God. He rules over rebels. Several times the book of John describes him as the ruler of this world. 2 Corinthians 4:4 even calls him the God of this world, with a small g of course. What this series has hopefully done is show the reality of those verses and illustrated that Satan is still very much at work in this world, as he has been from the beginning of time, using the same tricks over and over to deceive people into rebelling against God and turning worship towards himself. He has been the king of Tyre, or the spiritual force behind many human princes of Tyre, or antichrists, throughout history, from Nimrod to Ignatius Loyola to Adolf Hitler, and so on, and he is soon to raise up an end-time antichrist that will initiate a tribulation like the world has never seen before. But there's something important we need to understand before we end, and that is God's sovereignty over this situation. Despite everything we've heard about, understand that there is nothing that is beyond his control. God is far above every demon, antichrist, principality and power, and far above Satan himself. I think it's important to make this point because as we went through this series, it may have appeared that Satan was winning, that he was running rampant throughout history, raising up antichrists at will to manipulate, intimidate and destroy true believers. We can't help but see the encroaching darkness in our time as well, and it would be easy to think that there was little hope. But I want to show you how this works if I can. Go back to the oldest book of the Bible, the book of Job, and we find Satan in front of God's throne asking for his permission to test Job. God allows it, but he sets the boundaries, saying, "You may test him, do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically." Later on, Satan comes back again and asks for the boundaries to be loosened a little, and again God agrees, but again he defines the limits. Now what this basically tells us is that Satan is on a leash, and he can only do what God allows. And as 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. He gives us strength to endure it. This begs the question though, why does God allow Satan to attack us at all? Well, very simply, God allows us to suffer because when accepted with the right attitude, it refines us and purifies us. Suffering produces in us Christ-like character and prepares us for the freedom of the eternal kingdom to come. It's one of the most unfortunate things about human beings that when things are going well for us, we tend to forget about God and become comfortable, soft, self-sufficient, apathetic, and we don't actually do much growing. Suffering, on the other hand, sharpens our focus, our resolve, and turns our hearts and minds towards God. We lose our sense of self-sufficiency and are forced to accept our dependence on our Creator. It's in suffering that we actually develop our relationship with God the most. In the same way that turbulent water turns rocks into smooth pebbles, trials refines us. The truth is that we need trials to develop character. Romans 5:3-5 says, "We can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation, and this hope will not lead to disappointment." Zechariah 13:9 says that trials purifies or refines us in the same way that fire purifies and refines gold or silver. We need to go through the fire to be refined. 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, "For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever." So our suffering produces an eternal glory. I don't want to treat suffering lightly, but we need to see it through eternal eyes and recognize that this temporary life is only preparing us for eternity. We don't belong here, and we're not meant to invest all our hopes in this life. We are passing through a temporary, dying kingdom en route to an everlasting one, and the troubles we experience here are merely producing in us the kind of Christ-like character that we will need to become citizens of that future kingdom. Acts 14:22 says, "We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God." We are effectively in the wilderness on the way to the promised land right now. In the light of eternity, all present suffering in this wilderness will seem fleeting, like the blink of an eye, and it will have achieved a glorious end. Think of the greatest characters in the Bible and you'll notice this recurring theme. Before they reach their destiny, they often have to endure a wilderness first. Joseph, Moses, David, and even Jesus himself had to go out to the wilderness to be tested for 40 days and 40 nights. But the clearest example of this point comes in Exodus. When the Israelites left Egypt for the promised land, they had to endure a wilderness first. The wilderness was a proving ground for the Israelites, and they stayed there until they were ready for the promised land. God provided for them in that wilderness, but it was a wilderness nonetheless. Likewise, there is a promised land ahead for us Christians, and in the meantime, God will provide for us in this wilderness, but it is a wilderness nonetheless. Don't get too comfortable here. Like the Israelites, this isn't the destination. We're just passing through. Ephesians 2:10 tells us that we each have a job to do here that was planned for us long before we were even born. We've effectively been dropped in behind enemy lines in this world to carry out that mission. Some people need money for their mission, others don't. Some need health, others don't. But all of that is of secondary importance to the eternal goal. We've set our sights too low if we invest everything in the here and now. C.S. Lewis wrote, "We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased." We should be like soldiers abroad, focused on the task at hand but dreaming of the day the war is won and we get to go home. Now many Israelites lost heart in the wilderness and turned aside to the satanic mystery religion. That generation were therefore never permitted to enter the promised land. Similarly, in these last days we'll see people losing heart as well and turning to the mystery religion, and they won't see the promised land either. But others will stay the course and will one day see glory. Let us be one of them. Let our present troubles shape and mold and purify and help us develop a relationship with God and a dependency on God so that we will be ready for the promised land. And of course, let's do all we can to take as many people as we can with us. Our focus here can be summed up in the phrase, to know God and make Him known. Finally, as we see things getting darker all around us, we shouldn't be worried or afraid of the days to come. Instead, we should be incredibly excited that everything is happening exactly as God said it would, and that He is completely sovereign over the events that are about to take place. Jesus told us ahead of time in Matthew 24:25 what was going to happen so we wouldn't be caught off guard, and in Luke 21:28 He said that when we begin to see everything that was prophesied beginning to take place, that we should take heart, stand up and look up, for our salvation is near. Indeed, just as things seem darkest, we are actually closest to the dawn. Nothing illustrates this better than Jesus' own death and resurrection. While God in human flesh was being mocked, tortured, and nailed to a cross of wood, taking the punishment that we deserved upon Himself to give us life, outwardly it seemed that Satan was winning in that moment, that darkness would triumph. The disciples were scattering, lost, confused and afraid. It was the darkest hour. But actually this greatest evil in world history, the death of Christ, was just a precursor to the greatest good. Jesus' death bought freedom and everlasting life for anyone who would repent of their sin and trust in Him for salvation. He provided a way to God where there had been no way, and He orchestrated it all Himself. Judas Iscariot acted under the inspiration of Satan to betray Jesus, but Jesus himself initiated the process, telling Judas to go ahead and do what he had planned to do. When the officers came to take Jesus away, he said, "I was with you day after day in the temple. You did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." In other words, this hour has been given to you. You are taking me no sooner and no later than what my Father planned. In John 10:18, Jesus makes it clear that Satan isn't taking his life, saying, "No one can take my life from me. I sacrifice it voluntarily, for I have the authority to lay it down when I want to and also to take it up again, for this is what my Father has commanded." In other words, God remains sovereign even in what appeared to be Satan's crowning moment, and he's sovereign in our dark times too. In Daniel 2:21 we read that God controls the course of world events. He removes kings and sets up other kings. Daniel 4:17 says, "The Most High rules over the kingdoms of the world. He gives them to anyone he chooses." So in other words, all rulers, even evil ones, are allowed to rule only because God allows it for his own purposes. God sets the boundaries, and they are all completely at God's mercy. So let everyone who has watched this series know one thing about the days to come. God wins. Jesus reigns triumphant. Every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Satan will be thrown into the lake of fire along with his hordes of demons, and we will reign with Jesus in glory forever and ever. Satan's time is very short and getting shorter, and he knows it. So stand firm and keep your faith. Endure the trials. Let them mold your character and prepare you for glory. If you haven't given your life to God yet, do it now before it's too late. And Christians, carry out the task that God has for you here. Finish your race. Don't back out of the war and bow to manipulation or intimidation, and in the end you will receive everlasting life.